Amen. All right, tonight is 2 Samuel part 8, and we're going to be looking at chapter 8. This time going through 2 Samuel, I've just tried to keep the lessons on each chapter. In fact, and I can already tell you there's a couple times I've wanted to break free from this. So burdened for this matter of prayer and what we have for our future and making it a matter of prayer. For us to really spend some concentrated time in prayer for those things that we need and for our future, for the leadership, and for God to bring us more souls and for us to see souls saved, souls baptized, and us get the opportunity to disciple those new Christians and to help them to grow. Well, tonight, again, we're getting into 2 Samuel chapter 8. There's only 18 verses. Kind of comes in two parts. I've just titled this, though, David's Military Conquest. And I've broken it down into just two categories, but you'll see I'm going to break each one of those up into subcategories as well. But from verse 1 to verse 14 are David's conquered nations, those nations that David conquered. And then in verses 15 through 18 is David's rule, or how did he rule his nation, and the administration, how did he divide it? He had other people to help him. You'll see as we go through this, for instance, that David and his nations that he conquered the Philistines, the Moabites, the Syrians. I never see him called the Zobites, but just the nation of Zobah, Hamath, Amalek, Ammon, and Edom. And those are the primary ones that you'll read about in this particular chapter. When you get into David's rule, I won't cover that until we get down to it. But it's a very interesting chapter that follows, again, the revelation that God had given David rest from all of his enemies. Remember that had happened. He gave him rest. David was sitting at home, decided that, this isn't right, that I sit in this beautiful cedar home. So if you remember, there was another king who was currying the favor of David and brought him all that lumber, that cedar. Well, they didn't build a house in a week, and as probably as ornate and large as this was, it probably took them quite some time. So when you start reading that rest, and then when it says, and then happen, it's not really trying to give you all the chronology as far as timing is concerned. In fact, what you're going to read about tonight is a lot of summary battles. And then there's a little break in chapter 9, and then you'll read some of those battles will be expanded upon, explained a little bit more in chapters 10 and 11. So during this time, of course, of peace, David received the covenant, assuring him of an everlasting king that would sit upon his throne over a kingdom that would see no end. He was also told, if you remember, that he wouldn't, but his son would build the temple that would house the ark of the Lord. I also want to encourage you, every time you read this, to just stop, meditate on it, and think a little bit about the fact that David is a type of Christ. Not in everything, because he sinned with Bathsheba. He committed murder with Uriah the Hittite. There are other things where David really failed. But we have to assume that from the way that David was before, every time before he did anything, he sought the Lord. And he wanted, should I go? Should I go up? And remember, that was his pattern. I have no reason to think that it's any different here, that he is seeking the Lord's will on what he should do and how should he do it. And as far as you and I are concerned, we may find in our spiritual life that God gives us a time of rest from our enemies, a time of peace. But be sure that that's temporary. It always is going to be temporary because we're going to have battles, confrontations, troubles, and tribulations in this world. So David did take the initiative, and you'll see that in this, though it doesn't say everything here. We get a little bit from 1 Chronicles chapter 18, which is kind of the parallel passage, but it doesn't add a lot of information, just a little bit, but it also gives us enough to know that David, in everything, every nation that he conquered, he gathered together materials, I think, with a thought towards building the temple of the Lord. And you can see that. So these are, of course, not the only battles, wars, or conflicts and conquests of David, but they are the ones recorded for us to show us the growth and the establishment of his kingdom. It also demonstrates how God protected and preserved David in these particular battles. And it's interesting to note that they are primarily summaries of the battle. You don't get into the details, but there are extra pieces of information about the battle that just kind of makes you think, or makes you wonder, or makes you go wow a little bit. In some we see only that David smote them and subdued them. That's pretty much it. But one of the things you'll also see, and along with the names that I have to the left side of your screen, the Philistines, Moabites, Syrians, Zobah, Hamath, Amalek, Ammon, and Edom, you'll also see all of the particular areas where they were. Hamath is up here, Zobah here, you've got Ammon, you've got Moab, you've got Edom, and in this area, all the way up here, you'll see the river Euphrates. All the way down here, you'll see where you have the brook of Egypt. Now that is actually the area that God promised to Abraham. So David is not just conquering arbitrarily. He's going after the land that God had promised Israel. And he is getting rid of the nations that are in there, or he is subduing them and making them pay homage and tribute to David and the nations. Now, when you look at these particular list of nations, only one of them submitted voluntarily and willingly after he heard what David was doing, and that's the King Toi of Hamath. And you'll see the connection there in verses 9 and 10 when we get a little bit further along. David, basically, like I said, he's cleaning out the enemies and claiming the lands and the cities. And all of these enemies, most of them by and large, their forces are destroyed, or they are forced to join with David. And in fact, he uses some of them to his end. So with that, let's go ahead and start reading. And we're going to look at, first of all, out of the conquered nations, the Philistines. After this, it came to pass that David smote the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Metheg out of the hand of the Philistines. Now, a lot of people will wonder about that word, Metheg. It means a metropolis. And it's probably, if you read in Chronicles, it says the city of Gath. But the city of Gath had towns around it. So I tell you, sometimes commentators will just, well, we don't know what this is. We don't know where this is. Just use your common sense. Gath and a lot of other towns, just like you've got Sacramento. And what are we? We're a suburb of Sacramento. So there's a metropolis. The metropolis covers more than just Sacramento. So it covers all the other towns that are around it. And so that's all that means. But here that's interesting too, that you need to see that David led his army. David did not send his army. I hope you understand what I'm referring to there. David got into the battles with them. In fact, you'll read much later where David goes out into battle and he gets worn out because he's older. And I can understand that. It's just like the things that you used to do when you were younger. You could go out and do it, no problem, and go back home and rest up, and then you're ready to go again. But, you know, then there are times when you go out and do some of that stuff, and you got to stop and take a rest. You know, it's just, I remember there's things, you got to pull the chair out and sit down, look at everything for a while, and wait till your strength comes back. But he will, and you know, you can see that in chapter 21, 15, where he does get tired and fatigued. I mean, look, you're talking about everywhere they go, they're walking. They're not riding horses. They're not leading away with chariots. You'll see some of that tonight in the enemy, but we'll get to that in a little bit. It also just basically refers to the stronghold of the Philistines, which now I believe probably, like when you read it a little bit later, what he does to Syria, what he does to Edom, he builds a garrison there. Or he takes over one of the enemy's garrisons and he makes sure that the enemy doesn't ever rise up. So he creates some strongholds for the forces of Israel in their particular location. Verse 2 are the Moabites. And he smote Moab and measured them with a line. Again, this is one that, again, commentators get a little confused about in some areas. It says he measured them with a line. I'm not kidding you. Some people will say, well, he took all the men and had them lay down on the ground and he measured them. I'm like, can you really see that's what David did? And the idea is he cast them to the ground, he conquered them. When it says he measured them, he really did kind of, the idea of measuring them was he divided them. He lined them out. And what did he do? He divided them into two particular groups, or three groups, and in two of them he wiped them out. He put to death. But with one full line, it says he kept alive. And so the Moabites became David's servants and brought gifts. So he destroyed, again, their forces. He measured them out. He made sure that none of them could ever come back against him. So it's a very likely treatment of the Moabites, too, that if you remember going back, David had gone into the Moabite region for safety, and he brought his family there. Remember that? Brought his parents there. And it's very likely that they did not, because this is why David measured them out and wiped them out, is because they did not give David's family the protection that they had promised. You won't read that there, but you won't read any more about David's family that were in the Moabite region. So it's likely they were wiped out. How they were wiped out, what happened to them, we don't know. Not Moses, but most of the commentators will also remind us that there was a prophecy back in Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17 where it says that Moab would be struck in her corners. And that's kind of the idea of the four corners, be struck by the scepter of Judah. Well, that's David. This particular activity that happens here fulfills that prophecy. So Moab wiped out for a couple of different reasons. It fulfills prophecy, but also David was probably harder on them because, again, like I said, it's probably because they did not afford his family the protection that they had agreed on originally. Verse 3, we have the kingdoms of Zobah and of Syria. Zobah is actually, it says, part of the kingdom of the Syrians, but it's still separate. They seem like a couple of nations that had joined together. And so David smote also Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to recover his border at the river Euphrates. Now some people again will say, well, this is where you had two armies traveling and David met up with one while they were trying to recover their border. I said, no, it was when David, he was going full force all the way up to the river Euphrates, where Abraham was promised that from here down to the brook of Egypt, this is going to be your land. So David was going to recover his border. That's what I believe it was, at the river Euphrates. So he's establishing that, and then verse 4, and David took from him, and look at this, David took from him 1,000 chariots, and 700 horsemen, and 20,000 footmen. And David houghed all the chariot horses, but reserved of them 400 chariots. Houghed means hamstring, or hamstrung, as the case may be. It is a form of crippling a horse so that it can no longer be used for driving their chariots, for being ridden in a cavalry. Really, that horse is good for nothing except just put out to pasture. It doesn't kill them, but it makes them not able to function as men will do. You might, you might feel bad, but I think that David was looking back at what Joshua was commanded by the Lord. And in fact, in Joshua chapter 11 and 6, you'll see that Joshua was commanded to do that very thing to the enemy's horses. If you go back into Deuteronomy, we also learn that God commanded Israel that the king should never multiply to himself horses. Never. Not supposed to do that. I think there's two reasons for that. Number one, it was to prevent them from creating a market for horses. Because if they're in the market for horses, then somebody's going to be trying to sell them horses. Where do you get most horses? Back to Egypt. What did he not want? God did not want for Israel to go back to Egypt and begin to see their leeks and onions and all the comforts that they had, and that they might want to go back under that lifestyle of the Egyptians. But also, as I read to you from, or told you about Deuteronomy 17 and verse 16, that God told them, don't collect a lot of horses. That's why if you see, David only kept 100 of them. That's nothing compared to 1,000 chariots, and probably a lot more horses than that for that particular reason. Why is that? Again, so that they would not, and David would not, begin to depend upon their cavalry for strength. We say, why not? David, if you remember, was pretty sharp in the way that he got the bows and arrows, the slings, a lot of the other weaponry to his men that were on foot. But David never acquired a lot of horses, and you'll never see that with David. And the reason was God wanted them to depend upon him and not the strength of their cavalry. Remember, there was a time later that David sinned in numbering his men. God didn't want him to do that either. Why not? Because he doesn't want you to depend upon your strength. Depend on me. Well, that's a good classic example for you and I. We also a lot of times think about the advantages that this might give. Well, let's do it this way. Well, let's collect that, because we can get stronger if we have this. You know what? A lot of times God doesn't want that, because he wants you to be totally and utterly dependent upon him. And when you win the victory, you know why you won the victory. You couldn't have done it on your own. You couldn't have done it with your military might. You did it because of the Lord. Verse 5. And when the Syrians of Damascus, and this is why you see that coupling of Zobah with the Syrians, he said, and when the Syrians of Damascus came to succor, or to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David slew of the Syrians 22,000 men. So 22,000 men. The Syrians didn't do themselves or the men of Zobah any good. The information we get from this battle really is a very huge loss of men, the destruction of their cavalry, and the establishment of an Israeli compound. Look at it in verse 6. Then David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought gifts. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. Whatever David did. Well, prior to that, I believe again, to follow the pattern, the reason why the Lord was with him and preserved him was because David prayed before he went after anybody. He got permission from the Lord. Verse 7, now we're getting somewhere. And David took the shields of gold that were on the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took exceeding much brass. Again, you will see that there is a lot of taking of gold, silver, and brass and bringing it back to Jerusalem. But it's important to note that David did this not that he might be enriched, but it was all for the intention of using it in the building of the Lord's house. That's what it was for. Next we see the kingdom of Hamath. The king, well, I forgot to read verse 8, but I think I read it to you from Betah and from Berothai. Cities of Hadar, David took exceeding much brass. Then Hamath, verse 9 and 10, matter of fact. And when Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had smitten all the host of Hadadezer, then Toi sent Joram, his son, unto King David to salute him and to bless him. Why? Because he had fought against Hadadezer and smitten him. For Hadadezer had wars with Toi. So they were already enemies, and he was very excited. But it also, he knew that he never conquered the king that was there. And so he knew that it was a good idea to make a league for his own safety and for his kingdom. And Joram brought with him vessels of silver and vessels of gold and vessels of brass. So he took, the king of Hamath, took necessary steps to survive and keep his power and submit to the rule of David so that his people would also survive. David, again, is our type of Christ who is fighting to remove the enemy from our lives and for us to be able to live the victorious Christian life. This prefigures, again, our victory that Christ secures for us. On some of the latter lessons as well, in fact, lessons, I should say, verses, you'll see more gold, silver, and precious stone. And that's why in verses 11, 12, and so on, we'll see a little bit more about the dedication of the spoils. So all of these conquered nations, what happened? Which also King David did dedicate unto the Lord. Now again, he didn't just do it this once. Every time he came back after a battle, every time he had gathered together the loot, the gold, the silver, the precious stones, whatever it might have been, the brass and so on, especially the brass, and you'll see it in just a minute, he brought it back to Jerusalem for a particular purpose. Verse 12 summarizes pretty much all of the battles and gives us two names that you don't read of anywhere else but here, of Syria and of Moab and of the children of Ammon and of the Philistines and of, the second one we hadn't read about, Amalek, and of the spoil of Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. So the spoil of its conquest did not go to David. I believe again that this was preparation for the building of the house of the ark of the Lord. And if you go into, as I said, 1 Chronicles, and here I'm going to show you the verses, 1 Chronicles 18, verses 7 and 8, where it says, and David took the shields of gold that were on the servants of Hadad, it's misspelled in that verse, Hadadezer, and brought to Jerusalem, likewise from Tibhath and from Chun, cities of Hadadezer, brought David very much brass. Look at this, wherewith Solomon made the brazen sea and the pillars and the vessels of brass. So David was collecting the materials already. So he had a previous dedication, then he has another dedication, and probably every time he came back with the loot from a conquering nation, he used every bit of it to dedicate it to the building of the temple. Back to our text, verse 13. And David got him a name when he returned from the smiting of the Syrians in the valley of Salt, being 18,000 men. Now, some commentators say this is just he became well known. Others say that they made a memorial, a plaque or something to David for this great battle and what he had done in this valley of Salt. You'll also see a little bit later that, again, in 1 Chronicles 18, where it talks about another man. If you remember him, his name is Abishai. Abishai was the brother of Joab, and they had another brother that was killed that they both got upset about. But it was Abishai that really was in charge of killing these 18,000 men. Chronicles gives him the credit as well as David, but here David. And I think some say his name just became well known. I think that it was probably very likely that there was some sort of memorial given for David that made him more well known. But the news is really spread. And to do this, remember, even when we saw Syria hearing about what David had done, or the king of Hamath, the king that was there, and how he sent his son, this didn't happen in just a week or 2 weeks. This is an elongated period of time. Verse 14, where again David is in his great exploits, he's also securing his kingdom by putting garrisons around in these different nations. Probably not so much in some as maybe leaving a small part of his army forces there, but in Syria and Edom, certainly he put garrisons, like here. He put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom put he garrisons, and all they of Edom became David's servants, and the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. It's the second time we see that God is giving credit to himself for protecting David. David is not giving himself credit for being stronger or mightier or wiser than his enemy. The prophet's certainly letting us know that it was the Lord who kept him alive and got this fame that he had. We read in these verses, too, how the Lord empowered David. You don't know exactly how. It's just the fact that he preserved him. In every one of these battles, you'll see how is it that he could. We don't even read about any of the losses at all. We don't know if he had any losses, but we know in all that we see, there's about 40,000 in just 2 battles, at least 40,000 men of the enemy that were wiped out and killed. That's quite a battle indeed. Now we go to, from verse 15 to verse 18, David's rule and administration. First part of this, David reigned over all Israel. So we now see a united kingdom. That's not going to last too long, but under David, it is a united kingdom. And David executed judgment and justice unto all his people. The emphasis is here is that there were no insurrections, there's no tribal interfighting, they were a united people, and David established his kingdom by honoring the Lord, and in everything that he did, and you're going to see a lot of the men that he put in charge of different directions, but I think he told them all, we're going to be just, we're going to be honest, there's not going to be any bribery, there's not going to be any falsehoods. Remember, you go back to the Judges, and with Eli, you had a very corrupt administration of both their religious and their civil affairs. They had gotten really corrupt. Well, this is telling us David wasn't that way. He was not corrupt, and he would not allow any of the people that he put in charge to be corrupt either. So when you read about these names that are upcoming, both in the religious and the civil system, there was complete honesty and justice and judgment, fair judgment, and it was available to everybody. Now, many of these appointments that you're going to read about are really kind of like what happens today. You have rewards for good service, men who were fighting the good fight. And remember, Joab, the reason why he became commander-in-chief, in fact, we might as well go ahead and read that about Joab and Jehoshaphat, but Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the host, meaning he became the general of the military, or if kind of our idea, he became the Secretary of Defense. But unlike our Secretary of Defense, Joab was involved in the fighting. There was a reason why he excelled, and it was because of his activities and how he proved himself, the way that you'll see with some of these others. Jehoshaphat, who's also in this verse, and that's not the Jehoshaphat that later becomes king, but he is one who kept all the official records when it talks about him being the recorder. He was the diplomatic correspondent. Some say that he was also the one who was in charge in the palace, that when people came to see the king, you went through him. Whether that's true or not, don't really know. Then you have in verse 17, Zadok, Ahimelech, and Sariah. Zadok and Ahimelech both become the priest. In other words, they became the high priest. One became the high priest at one time. It looks like the other became his assistant or second in command. And then later you'll see where Ahimelech becomes the high priest. And then you have Sariah, where he was the scribe. David, in fact, in 1 Chronicles chapter 15, recognizes both Zadok and Ahimelech as the chief of the fathers of the Levites. So that's why he called them to be the high priests. You read about them in 2 Samuel chapter 15 again, where they're involved in the carrying of the ark. Remember how we read about the ark was put on a cart. That never happens again after that particular time. Sariah was a scribe, or some will say that he was the personal secretary of David. Verse 18 then gives us Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over both the Chetherites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were chief rulers. Benaiah seems to be the head of David's personal security. In other words, he was the head over the home of David and his personal protection. So David had men that were around him, around his palace, and that's who Benaiah was in charge of. Some of these, the Chetherites and the Pelethites, were not Israelis, but they were those who showed themselves to be loyal and joined up with David. Very interesting that that's the fact that they were called in other places mighty men. They were talked about as fighting bravely and fought valiantly for David. So later, Benaiah is the one who becomes the head of Solomon's armed forces. He is also the one who ends up dragging Joab out of the tabernacle and killing him. So if you remember, Joab goes in and grabs hold of the altar. He's not going to let go, but he got drug out and killed. David's sons, they became the chief rulers. Some, it says, decide that they were ministers. David is not going to violate the ministry of the priesthood by putting his relatives in the priesthood. You had to be a Levite. So when it's talking about they were ministers, it's the same way that they were close advisors, or they helped manage the affairs of the kingdom of David. What's interesting in all of this is no enemy could stand against David, because David had the Lord help him wherever he went. The Lord promoted David. The Lord prospered David. And I believe it's because David sought the Lord in every encounter, just as he had been doing before. And he was careful, he was just, and he was humble. And that's what the Lord is showing in this particular chapter. I pray that's been a blessing to you tonight. Just to cover it again a little bit and give you a little bit more history of David's kingdom, his military conquest, and his enlargement of the land and gathering the fullness of his property, that, or the